Hajime!
Greetings, Legionaries. I find myself here once again in Dixieland, one of my favorite places in the world. Absolutely, there are many Cavaliers here and ghosts of wars past, and I've come here to actually give praise, but also to meet a good Cavalier, a friend of mine, Mark from Pearl Snap Tactical. Welcome, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Why don't you pass that whiskey over here? Because my cup's getting low.
Are you a bourbon guy or a whiskey guy?
I'm a little bit of all the above, man. I find good whiskey, bourbon, or whatever. It suits the palate just fine as long as it's quality.
Amen. Amen. Well, Mark, I'm glad that you're here in the talk because, I think as we're looking at the election, and I kind of try to skirt politics a little bit. At least what I mean by politics is the day-to-day sport ball politics, which
Yeah.
is blue team or red team going to win, go team go kind of situation.
Yeah.
Because I think it's kind of missing the point. And of course, it has immediate effects. There are some medium-term effects, but I think the grander scheme of things, and as Spangler would talk about, is like the cycle of civilization. And this is not a new concept, right? And I'm sure that we talked about this before, on some back channels and just shooting the shit.
hmm
But, I know that part of I guess I wanted to talk about specifically your project and how that fits into the meta-political circumstance we find ourselves in today.
Yeah, man. Well, I'm kind of, like you, I've got a military background. I've got about 12 years in the Army, both on the active duty and National Guard component in the infantry and intel world. And, I was always as a child kind of inspired by those warrior motifs. I was whether it was Conan the Barbarian or World War II picture, all of these stories, but I was particularly drawn to old myths and legends and sagas and things like that, because what I saw in there were men who were aspiring to become, right, to become more, to delve into the aristocracy and nobility of the soul, right, to expand their will on the world outside of them. You see it in the primordial myths, right? It's always the god or the being that goes out and slays the dragon, right? Which is a symbol for chaos, right? And from that, he builds a world, right? Just like when Odin and his brother Ymir, the giant, from his body, they built the earth, and then came mankind and all the other creatures, all those things. And so those are templates for our own lives, I think. And so obviously, if not everybody in the military is drawn to that, but for me, it was that kind of warrior mentality, that warrior soul that kind of drew me to the military. And like you, I got a little disenfranchised with what I saw because, I mean, we just have to face the fact we're living in a secular, humanist, materialistic world, right? That has abandoned those types of things. And even when we talk about things like spirituality and everything, a lot of times those are just kind of dumbed down terms and watered down that can mean, anything from your Baptist missionary talking about it to some dope smoking hippie, that's wearing Birkenstocks and stocks and working at Starbucks. You know what I mean? So those words don't mean a lot in our society, but they still hold value, and you can find those in the writings and in the stories of our ancestors. And even though it won't look exactly the same as you apply it in the modern world, right? You still got a water bill, you still got to work a job or whatever, but you can still pull the essence of those stories because they really do, I think, serve as a template for you for action to live a greater life. I don't know if I just answered your question, but anyway,
Yes.
stream of consciousness. Sorry.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's how I feel myself. I mean, I think this is not a new thing the last century or two, and Nietzsche talked about it in his own time, but this kind of ennui, right? This listlessness,
Right.
this lack of spiritual, I guess, tether, right? And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, my listeners know that I'm not at all partial to Christianity, but the point is that at that time, it certainly gave people context. It gave people means and
Mm-hmm.
meaning and purpose. And when Nietzsche said God was dead, he wasn't saying that like in an offensive way. The whole quote was God is dead, and I'm paraphrasing here. It's God is dead, and we have killed him. There won't be
Mm-hmm.
like torrents of blood to make up for the void or something like that. And effectively, he was
Right.
lamenting the passing of purpose and meaning, right?
Yes.
And he was
Yes.
trying to offer people an alternative, a way of simply, reasserting meaning and purpose in this life. And we
Mm-hmm.
see it as a psychological need in people. I know this sounds kind of strange, but there is actual real deep need in the human psyche for purpose. And when
Mm-hmm.
you people don't understand that religion is that very meaning, that kind of ephemeral metaphysical purpose that gives people context in their life. It makes them
Mm-hmm.
understand where they fit. And so, obviously, it's neither here nor there, but the interesting thing about Nietzsche, which people don't talk about, is that he was a huge champion of I guess, pre-Christian, heroic, Homeric virtue, right? The warrior
Mm-hmm.
virtues, and he's a huge disciple of Heraclitus, and he really expounded a lot of his philosophy from that first axiom. But I guess what I wanted to ask is, in reference to a time in which people fill their lives with pleasure, and it
Mm-hmm.
causes decadence and collapse.
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine that there are a lot of practical, political, and real life ramifications to basically what's happening civilizationally, spiritually, and I assume that's how Pearl Snap Tactical kind of factors in. How did it get started?
Yeah. So interesting question, because talking about those topics, and you see Pearl Snap Tactical and that's our podcast, you'd be like, huh? Like I thought this guy should be talking about gears and guns and stuff like that. And it certainly started out that way, and we certainly do talk about those things. I mean, if you go and you look at the episode titles, you'll see everything on there, like anatomy of the ambush. I did a series on just how ambushes work from a tactical perspective, why you need to understand the mechanics behind the ambush, because if you don't, then it makes it really hard to survive one, right? As a military guy or law enforcement or even civilian. So, and we got stuff on low light for your weapons, and how to dry fire, better practices for dry fire, how to shoot better. We run the gamut on that stuff. But I also, about midway through, by the time I finished my first season, I started getting input from people, and just people who had, particularly people who hadn't served in the military, that regretted it, but it's too late for them, right? They've grown up, they've got families established, they may have reached past the age where they can just go back in, either because they're too old or their life situation is just to where their responsibilities at home, that it just wouldn't be fair to uproot their family and do that. And I totally understand that. And so there was this kind of lament and this like, well, I'm all about this warrior virtue stuff and philosophy, but like, how do I get into that? How, not having served in the military. And the truth is, you don't have to have served in the military to avail yourself of those virtues and to live them, because, professional armies are really a thing of recent history, and as a recent phenomenon in terms of human history. Before that, it was your citizen of the polis or your citizen of the village or tribe. These guys or these men, our ancestors, were farmers, they were fishermen, They were cobblers. They were, whatever, roof thatchers, but they knew how to wield a sword, or they knew how to hack a body with an axe, right? Because they had to. That was part of life. And even in our own country, if you look at our history back in the Revolutionary War and the war between the states, or whatever conflict, oftentimes you'll see some of the biggest heroes from those eras were not from the professional soldier class, right? They were
Right.
frontiersmen. They were guys living out on the edge of civilization. So they had to embody these virtues and life skills as a point of necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with the way that cycles of civilization goes, and I don't know when, I don't have a crystal ball, but I just know from looking at history that everything, history is not linear, it's cyclical, and we go through cycles, right? Given enough, I think it's Zero Hedge. I don't really read that, but I have come across that blog. I don't know if you've heard of it, but I think their tagline is very profound, that says, given it a long enough timeline, the survivability rate drops to 0. And I think that's obviously, we know it's true for people, but it's true of empires, it's true of societies. And I think we find ourselves in that cycle, and I think we're on the downward spiral. And it's not, if you want to attribute it to anything, some people say, well, it's because the left, some people will say it's because the right, some people will blame Christianity, Christians will say it's because we've abandoned Christianity. But the fact, if you want to put the blame on anybody or anything, you got to put it at the feet of nature, because this is the natural order of things. You know what I mean? So, so to sit and lament it, which is what I find, which tends to be the main reaction to this kind of news when people see decline, to lament it, or to be angry, or to be scared, is the same of, do you lament? Are you afraid of getting old? I mean, I guess some people are, but that's just a natural cycle. We all know we're going to be born, we're going to age, we're going to reach the zenith of our strength and virility, and then we're going to give way to entropy. Yep. And we're going to, our body is going to corrupt. It's going to decline and we enter our elder years, and then finally we go and join our ancestors, just like those that did before us. So, it is natural. That doesn't mean that you just sit down and decide to quit work and go live on a mountaintop and not do anything with your life. I think it's the exact opposite. You want to forge your will. You want to expand your consciousness. You want to push your own becoming, right, and to the greatest extent that you can during your time that you have on earth. Because quite frankly, for me, I'm not just a materialist. I believe the soul goes on. I believe that, just like science says, energy can not be created or destroyed. Despite what your belief is, I think most of us would agree, unless we're just a hardened materialist, that your soul will continue in some shape or form. And so, I think it's, in some respects, you're still building here for the next life. So
I completely agree, and I've had a similar vision of the world for such a long time. And I mean, the truth is that, and this is something that it seems to me that most people really hate, they really despise talking about, but it's not just that all men die. All men suffer in this life. Very rough. In whatever way.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
It's not about, and this is part of the reason why I kind of have like a lot of contempt for liberal bourgeois society, Western society at large, is this idea that we should maximize comfort, for the masses as much as possible and avoid pain. And you realize that it's really at the other side of pain. On the other side of pain is life and the meaning
Right.
of purpose of existence. I mean, it's not just me saying that. I think most people understand that. But because the human, I guess, animal is so averse to pain, it takes a special type of psychopath, I guess, like myself, to come up with kind of Spartan type maxims, like run towards pain is my personal favorite. But not because necessarily I love pain, but because I know for a fact that it's pain that consecrates life itself, and that gives you purpose
Mm-hmm.
and depth and meaning. I mean, Nietzsche talks. I apologize. I'm going to basically suck off Nietzsche a little bit, so I apologize. But no, it's this idea that there's this quote in "Thus Spoke Zarathustra." It goes like something like, um, "You say, O brethren, that a war consecrates, or rather, a great meaning consecrates a war. No, it's a war that consecrates great meanings." And so
Mm-hmm.
ultimately it's pain and the suffering and everything else that actually gives a spur to life. I mean, think about it from a
Yeah.
national perspective. Forget civilizational, but national perspective. What gives an impetus to collective life is violent struggle. Think about, for
Mm-hmm.
instance, in the United States, the overarching paradigm of the United States is still the Civil War. No other war has
Mm-hmm.
been so bloody as the Civil War, and it still to this day evokes emotions. It is the
Mm-hmm.
font of culture and meaning
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
purpose. I mean, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
I know my ancestors that fought in the Civil War. I know a lot of people that do themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
it's not just the Southerners, but it's also the Northerners as well, and
Mm-hmm.
even for instance the civil rights whatever communist stuff of 1965 was had to build on the foundation of the Civil War itself. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess the greater point that I'm trying to make is that same paradigm does not evoke the same, I guess, emotional or willful imagination as say World War I or World War II. In fact, I don't even
Mm-hmm.
remember anyone of my family that served by name in World War I, but I do know that they did. Whereas I know by name all my ancestors that fought in the Civil War. And I
Hmm.
know also, for instance, that a lot of our literature comes from, the I guess the pamphlets and political thought of the 1860s and 50s, right? It's
Yeah.
interesting that it really I hate to say this, but and I hate Marx, but he was right that blood moves the wheels of history. It's awful, but
Yeah.
it's true. And
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that ultimately life at base is a conflict of wills, right? A conflict of
Right.
nations and on an individual basis, on a tribe basis, if that makes sense, on a factional
Mm-hmm.
basis, national, civilizational, and so on. And
Yeah.
the greatest mistake we could ever make is to, like, I guess, assert this pacifist understanding of life. But I think
Mm-hmm.
pacifism is death. I think it's
Right.
death, and I think it's been pointed out. But to give it full circle, I completely agree with you about the warriors. I think that ultimately anyone can be a warrior, and if anything, in the modern military, so very few soldiers are warriors, and I mean that as
Mm-hmm.
service members in general.
Yeah.
And, obviously, I encourage a lot of my listeners to join your respective militaries to serve because I think there is something, a benefit there. But if you
Mm-hmm.
didn't have the opportunity because of a medical problem or, it just didn't work out for your life or whatever it may be, remember, that's not the end of the line. Like, there are
Right.
other alternatives, and I think Pearl Snap
Mm-hmm.
Tactical can definitely help you find the way, if that makes sense. And I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about Pearl Snap. How did that
Mm-hmm.
name come about? Because I'm a little bit curious.
Yeah. So, yeah, yeah, it just kind of came as a result of a joke. I mean, obviously, we're in Dixieland down here, and I travel to different states as part of my business. I run firearms training, tactical courses. I've done some contracts for the DoD and trained some military units. Not a lot. Most of it is law enforcement and civilians. And one of the places I went up to and that I go on a regular basis is Kansas, the free state, right? So I was up there in Kansas a few years ago, and my business partner, who also is an Army veteran and a veteran of Ranger Battalion and stuff like that, and he's super high speed. So we're up there and we're running this rifle course. It was a 2-day course, and again, he's from the same state as me down in the South. So we talk distinctly different than people up in Kansas, and people are just kind of making fun of us. And one of the kind of stereotypical types of apparel that you'll find people wearing down in the South are pearl snap shirts, right?
Mhm.
And so somebody is like, somebody made reference about, oh man, look at that. Here comes the Pearl Snap brothers. You should call this thing Pearl Snap Tactical. And I was like, dang, man, God, that was just such genius. And so, I already had a business name. So that was already taken. I was like, well, I can't rebrand that, but I could start a podcast. And so the guy that said that unfortunately has passed away, but as an homage to him, we call it Pearl Snap Tactical. So,
Hell yeah. No,
yeah, man.
I love Dixie. I'm actually a dirty Yankee, so I have to apologize to my listeners here, but I do love, my time living in the South is just a different culture. I think the best thing I appreciate about American Southerners and Dixiecrats, Cavaliers, is actually the Cavalier culture. It's very interesting. I wrote and read about this extensively, but the idea is that the Englishmen who came over and colonized in the South, they were gentlemen. They were the Roundheads. They were Cavaliers. They were warriors. And obviously, part and parcel of that is the honor culture. Of basically, if someone disrespects you or your family or your family name, it was seen as honorable and dutiful to challenge a man or at the very least get into a fist fight. And I think for me, that is probably one of the most honorable and beautiful things America has ever given birth to, because in the North, it's settled by these freak Puritans, loser type individuals that are all about this freak submission type stuff. In fact, one of my favorite American heroes is this guy named Giles Corey. He got pressed to death, the only American to have ever been pressed to death as a type of capital punishment, because he refused to give false witness to a bunch of freak Puritans, right? And dealing with this stuff where women, denounce each other and all this kind of crap. You never saw that in the South. You saw gentlemen, and the aristocracy of an America is in the South. And I guess I wanted to ask you, did you have any experience with that? Do you see that in yourself? And is that something that Southerners feel is different about the South and the North still?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think some of those sentiments have abated just with time. You know what I mean? So I think, does my generation feel it as strong as my parents did? Probably not. Do they have it as strong as their grandparents did? No. I think the internet and connectivity and things like that has shrank. Things that I never would have seen in the South growing up in a small rural town, you will see now, just because the world is so connected now that, people are more citizens of their social media platforms than they are of their local community. Right. And so, if that makes sense.
Yes.
But yeah, there are still pockets where that exists. I mean, I think you're going to find it more in the rural areas than you would in, like, say, Atlanta, or, some other, big city, or Charlotte, Charlotte, North Carolina or something. You're probably, I mean, I'm sure you'll see some of it there, but you're not going to see it as much in those bigger metropolitan areas. Right. But yeah, I think there's still some of that there. The spirit of that's still alive. I think there's definitely a group of people that want to stamp that out. They're threatened by it for whatever reason, but I think it's part of who we are as Southerners. And yeah, I'd say it's still here.
Yeah, it's always the losers, right? It's the pathetic, botched, and the bungled, the human bug man that hates that, because it would actually cost him courage. It would actually entice him to courage and honor, concepts that are completely alien to his slave stock. But what I'm trying to say is that ultimately, the reason why people say it's connectivity, and that connectivity ultimately brings about equality and liberal values and stuff, and I think that's completely false. I think the truth is that the people that are exposed to the internet, or are usually digital quote-unquote natives, they're ones that are putting out content which normalize a basically bugman existence, right? And part and parcel of my project here with Sergeant Barnes, aside from getting hammered and talking about war, is to be a proselytizer of the martial ethos, of the honor culture
Yeah.
that existed in the South and much of the world. And
Mhm.
I mean, Gramsci, this guy, this communist guy named Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, he talked about how politics and power are downstream from culture, right? And so to
Mhm.
be able to ensnare a people, you have to first effuse what you believe out into the world, and you have to condition society to basically be partial to your ideas of the world and your ideals and your values. And it has to be a volume thing as well as it has to be
Mhm.
connote, it has to evoke
Yeah.
emotionality as well. But the greater point
Yeah.
that I'm trying to make is I think what is called conservative. I refuse to call myself conservative because it's a false frame, but
Mhm.
the idea of right-wing values, quote unquote, or martial values. The reason why that's on the ebb, or was until relatively recently, until the last I think 50 years, is because there is a lack of cultural production that comes from our, or at least my perspective. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Obviously,
Mhm.
if I say anything controversial, I take the onus of that burden. Okay, I don't want
Yeah.
Mark to be suffering for it. But what I'm trying to say is that ultimately, what I enjoy so much about guys who go out and do for instance, civilians who contract with you to do,
Mhm.
tactical lessons, who listen to our podcast, that read books and dream great dreams. They are part and parcel of this spirit that's a becoming spirit of the return of higher life, the return of
Mhm.
honorable men and women. But I don't want to get too carried away here. I guess what I wanted to ask you, because even though I've been called an old head, I'm actually a very new guy. I wanted your perspective because I know that you were like in the military during the Yugoslav wars,
Mhm.
and I wanted
Mhm.
your like perspective on how the military's changed since I guess the immediate post Cold War like
Yeah.
environment and now.
Yeah. So yeah, I've kind of had both. I guess what you say, feet straddling both worlds, like pre GWOT and post, because I had a big break in service, right? So I came in. I'm an older guy, but I came in the '90s, and it was during the drawdown, and it was after the Iron Curtain had fell, and all of a sudden Russia wasn't the big boogeyman anymore, or the Soviet Union, I should say.
Uh-huh.
They were at the time, there was this feeling that, hey man, maybe these guys were all right after all. It was just the government that was evil, but Russians, hey man, they're just people like us. And so there was a lot more openness, but the military really didn't have a mission. And when that happens, then all kinds of crazy stuff with policies and tactics and stuff like that start changing. But yeah, so I was part of Operation Joint Endeavor, which I think, if my history is right, that's the first time NATO's ever grounded or fielded a ground force on a campaign.
Huh.
I think I could have that wrong. Someone can fact check me, but it was one of the first times, at least. I mean, they had used air power and things like that, had air campaigns and
Mm.
stuff, enforcing no flying zones. But I think that was the first time. Um, or maybe Korea, I don't know, but it was the first in my memory, right? So
Right.
anyway, kind of dealing with that and seeing what the culture was, what the equipment was, and things like that. And then I had an injury, and I had to get out, and I had a 20-year almost break in service, and then that's when I came back into uh, active duty wasn't an option. So I came into the guard component, and I did active duty time in the guard actually, but neither here nor there. But yeah, it was very, very different. Not just in terms of equipment, but just the culture. I mean, some things were the same, but it did take a little bit of an adjustment for me. And it's the same thing you'll hear. It doesn't matter who it is. You'll always have some old codger, whether he's a cop or what, maybe someone even that's a school teacher or whatever, that'll be like on the tail end of their career, being like, oh man, if I had a son or daughter, I'd tell them don't join. Things aren't as good as they were, as they used to be. And I think that's just part of nature too. Things, there was probably BS when those guys joined too, but when that's your first introduction to it, you don't know any different. So you get accustomed and acclimated to that level of BS, but then things start changing. and it changes in a way that maybe you don't like it. And so then you're like, oh man, now everything's going to crap. So, I'm certainly, fall victim to that as well. So and that's kind of where I see that some of that playing out as well. Some of that's just, your guys that come into the military, they're a segment of your society. So whatever your society is doing, you're going to have a section of that in whatever space you import that segment of society into. Now, I don't think all is lost. I mean, there's still some super quality people in the military. I don't want to say that they're, all bugmen or anything like that, but I do find in the military, there's a lot more coddling that used to be. There's a lot more hand holding. There's a lot more, I don't know. It's just a little softer, I guess, in some ways.
I guess the most interesting thing that I wanted to ask you is, as I'm a huge military science and arts history, obviously connoisseur, if that makes sense. And one of the most interesting things is, of course, the shift from conventional warfare, airland battle type doctrine to coin. And I kind of wanted to, I guess, pick your brain about how it is that the Army used to train soldiers and the emphasis of the Army back when the Cold War was a recent memory, right? And how that changed as far as not necessarily ROE, but I guess how warfighting is perceived by the modern soldier.
Well, definitely in the 90s, you're really kind of going off the map you have is the old map, right? You don't have a new map because you don't know what the world's going to look like. So you're trying to look forward, but you're still always fighting the last battle. And so definitely the training was more geared around a near peer threat and things like that. But we kept finding ourselves in these little brush fires, like these little smaller engagements. At the time they called them operations other than war, although there could be a kinetic component to that, or they would call it low intensity conflict, things like that you get involved in. And the Army really, I think we've seen, they're just not really good at that, at least how we were structured. And so then you go into coin and fighting insurgent groups. And even though now all the, and of course I don't represent the views of the DOD, I'm just speaking as a citizen here.
Right.
The training is still like we're always talking about, oh man, we got to get ready for a peer-to-peer or a near-peer threat. But right now, I mean, a lot of the training you're doing is still like you're fighting an insurgency, small groups and things like that. And so it just really hasn't, we're just not prepared there. You do have some things like in the Army, I can't speak about the other branches, but every year, most combat units will do what's a JRTC rotation down in Louisiana. It's like a month long. It's where you do kind of fight a peer threat, or actually they usually have the upper hand, right? The OPFOR has the upper hand, and it's designed to really test you and your capabilities to the utmost, right? So they're always gonna be able to jam your comms. They're always gonna, they know the lay of the land. They're always gonna be given distinct advantages, and you're always kind of on the back foot trying to deal with these guys. And then so Joint Readiness Training Center, that's what that one is. It's kind of that little place there. I don't think they still use it, but there is a moniker there called Tigerland, because that's where they used to get dudes ready for Vietnam. Because anyone who's done a JRTC rotation is, man, that's a different kind of humidity and heat. Like even me living in the South, I thought I was like all ready for it. And, it kicked my ass. I'll say that. And then there's a NTC, which is a national training center, which I think is out in California, which is kind of more of a desert. So those are probably about the, to my mind, what I see most units getting reps for, as far as peer-to-peer. But then when it comes to just their smaller field problems and exercises that they do, at least, and of course, I'm just talking about from my scope. You could talk to someone in a different unit that might have a different experience, but you're still seeing that old school kind of counterinsurgent type training, where it's like, hey, we're going to go hit this, and you're taking a platoon and you're fighting 2 op 4, or 3 op 4. I mean, it's just
right.
it's still geared on that old paradigm, to a certain extent. So just hasn't really caught up yet.
The interesting thing is obviously coin. For those of you who don't know and are trying to get acquainted, but coin is counterinsurgency, and counterinsurgency has a large emphasis on small scale unit tactics, and it's predicated on the idea that you have air dominance. Not just
Mm-hmm.
superiority dominance. You have IDF capabilities. You have basically superior fires and logistics and so on, but the enemy is pervasive. It's basically in your gills and all that good stuff. But as
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing in the Ukraine, conventional war is back on the menu, boys. And at the end of the day, it's also incorporating through hybrid warfare a number of different levels of warfare that kind of, in a strange and new combination, combine the idea of the partisan with the conventional with electronic and so on. And I was
Mm-hmm.
watching a lecture of multi-domain dominance, which is like the new army of 2030 or so on, and they were talking about this in depth. And I was reading about NATO specifically, and one of the most glaring and disturbing things about NATO or European powers' readiness is that there are hardly any military exercises which are on a unit level superior to that of a battalion. And for those of you who don't
Mm-hmm.
know, a battalion is roughly 1,500 soldiers or
Right.
servicemen. And
Mm-hmm.
the issue is that as you scale up, the more difficult it is to actually not simply go into combat, but also get good at maneuvering large elements, logistically supplying them, training them, doing X, Y, and Z, giving them ISR, giving intel, so on and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole C2 aspect of it. And it's really concerning to me is that the Europeans have been basically coasting in La La Land for the last 30 years, and
Yeah.
the only real land army in the entirety of that continent is France, and they still don't do big maneuvers like they used to during the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the
Mm-hmm.
greater point that I'm trying to make is I kind of wanted to just underline the fact that we're still stuck fighting the last war, and the last war was hardly
Yeah.
a war. It was like a police action, right? I mean, after
Mm-hmm.
2003, and we rocked Iraq shit, like, it was just a counterinsurgency, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to me that Russia and apparently, I mean, I'm not making any decisive claims here, but it's pretty obvious to me that they've defeated our proxy forces in the Ukraine. They've defeated a number of our different, weapon systems, whether it's our tanks, our Bradleys. They're able to spoof our smart munitions, which, by the way, is the mainstay of air-land battle. So, just to
Mm-hmm.
give the audience some background reference to what air-land battle is the Fulda Gap Cold War alternative to basically pitting mass against mass. We knew that the Soviets had out-tanked us, they had outmanned us, they had outwilled us for a little bit, and so we decided, okay, you know what this means? This means that the army has to be higher tech, more higher trained, and we need to focus the our main emphasis on defeating the communists by effectively severing their logistical nodes way in the rear of their conventional line units. And this would basically have the effect of withering their fruits on the vine, so to speak. Now, the implication, especially in the Ukraine, where the Ukrainians are using smart munitions, the Russians have a high efficacy rate of deterring and deflecting smart munitions by spoofing it. This is a
Mm-hmm.
very big problem for us Americans, because what this means is that their entire doctrine on which we built our army, our military in general, of everything, is basically negated. And if we're not able to enter a conflict that relies on air power and then of course follows up with that heavy mechanized army to push their shit in, we're going to lose. And this
Right.
comes at the coattails of China and Russia and so on. And I guess I wanted your perspective on, I guess the Army's change to 2030. I know that you can't say anything too critical or too positive because you're obviously serving, and I want to make sure that, we don't get into any trouble. But, I guess I wanted your perspective of the average soldier's perspective on UAVs, on, drones, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So, on that, I'm not I'm an enlisted guy, so I'm not at most of my time is spent like on the like squad to company level, right? So to speak, on matters on a strategic level, like like a colonel or general would be able to. I just don't have that same bandwidth,
Of course.
right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I what exactly? I guess I'm. Can you reframe the question? Like,
Sorry, I
what do you want
apologize.
from that perspective? No, no,
It,
no. I'm just kind of a thickhead on that stuff. But
are drones really that kind of game-changing device as some people are making it out to be? In
you
your
know,
opinion?
the answer to that is I don't know yet. I think the book right now is currently being written on that.
Hmm.
I think obviously when I first came in, drones were coming online and they were huge. They were kind of big, bulky kind of thing, and then now you're seeing those. They're much more. They're smaller. They're faster. The capabilities that they're able to equip them with has certainly accelerated. And yeah, that is a danger. I mean, we just had some dude come off deployment in the Middle East that were having to deal with drones, and just talking to those guys, they were, it definitely got their attention. You know what I mean?
Of
I'm not
course.
sure we fully have an answer for that.
Hmm.
And like I said, I think the book's still being written.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember the first time I saw drones being part of major conventional exchange, and this was a very little known conflict called the Nagorno-Karabakh. I can't even pronounce this freaking language, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the Armenian versus Azeri conflict. And
Mm-hmm.
overall, the Armenians have been successful in times previous, in conflicts previous. It's a continuous thing. For those of you who don't know, it's a continuous fight. It's just one of these like low-level ethnic fights that have been happening. But the Azeris have the benefit of huge amounts of petroleum money. And what they did in roughly, I think it was 2017, 18, was this very short, sharp war from a completely reformed and modernized Azeri military, which at the forefront of this was drones and UAS, cheap UAS systems, right? ISR,
Mm-hmm.
all that stuff, huge C2 improvement. Their equipment didn't actually improve much compared to what it had been previously. They still had those old tube artillery. They still had, the old Soviet pattern, everything
Mm-hmm.
basically.
Mm-hmm.
But what changed was the drone and C2, which for those of you who don't know,
Yeah.
command and control is basically not just simply like the culture, but also the technical radios, the communications, how it is that you
Mm-hmm.
coordinate elements, all that good stuff. And they, completely annihilated Armenian positions where previously it was kind of a very even match. And it was a huge change because the Armenians were not prepared. They did not have the drones at all, and the Azeris did, and it was a decisive factor, which led to their short and sharp campaign victory, and ultimately,
Yeah.
it looks like they're going to annex it. But my point is, I guess Ukraine is interesting because both sides have pretty pronounced uh, electronic warfare capabilities, and also
Mm-hmm.
both sides have these drones. But the difference between this small conflict and Ukraine is that Ukraine is a vastly larger conflict with
Right.
industrial size, amounts of expenditure, and so you're getting to the bottom of the barrel and you're getting to the point where you have to economize. Whereas, the Azeris just clobbered them, and they had basically an infinite amount of resources for the time of conflict they had, right? And I guess
Yeah.
just full circle, what I'm trying to say is it seems to be very decisive. It seems to actually make a huge difference, but it seems to be not that decisive in an industrial sized conflict, which I assume, and I'm not putting words in your mouth because I don't want to
Hmm.
get in trouble, but I assume would be at the forefront of any conflict between the United States and the PRC, especially in Taiwan.
Yeah, because that's a really interesting take. I mean, because like I said, when I first came online, back in the day when drones were kind of getting out there, and you were seeing it, and I would say this was probably even into the beginning of the GWOT. The primary function of the drone really was for like, you always talk about dudes that were like using drones kind of for intel purposes, right? So it was to get an aerial view. You could actually use it for scouting purposes to kind of inspect routes or avenues of approach that you were moving on to see if someone was kind of ahead of you, right? It was just kind of an automated type scout kind of thing. Or I've got buddies that were in special operations that would be, they come in off of a mission or whatever, and so they're on their downtime, but they're in the talk watching the drone feed of some other unit conducting its exercise, so it was
Right.
part of that command control kind of thing. But then it's evolving, or has evolved to where now there's more offensive capabilities to it too. And that's the part that I said, I think the book is still being written on that, because we have not dealt with that, as a force. I mean, we're utilizing it, but we're not having it utilized it against us until very recently, and so yeah, it definitely is top of mind. Originally, I think back in the 90s, the big concern was sea burn, a gas attack or chemical attacks or things like that. Those were the things on your mind that, for me, I can't speak for everybody, but that scared me more than a dude with a gun. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
dude with the gun, I can orient to that. I can lay suppressive fire for my buddy to go up and flank him, or we can deal with that. But when you've got a gas, coming into your area, that's a whole different kind of animal. And I think the drones are going to kind of, I don't know if I'd say take the place of it, but definitely add that added wild card element to it.
Absolutely. I,
and
I saw
and they're
the,
so, yeah.
I saw one of them was outfitted with thermite. It was insane. I was like, holy crap.
Oh yeah, man. Yeah. Well, there's plenty of feeds coming out of Ukraine that is on open source that you can watch what they're doing and sending them into the trenches, and dudes that are dismounted from armored assets and stuff like that. And it's just yeah, that part is kind of scary.
Yeah, absolutely. But well, brother, I want to end this transmission here a little bit sooner because I know that you and I we have to sip some drinks and survey the surroundings outside the talk, maybe go on patrol a little bit downtown Dirtle. But what I would like to say is, before we go, how can my legionaries follow your content? Where can they contact you and all that good stuff?
So right now, what I'm trying to push everybody to is our Substack page. So it's Pearl Snap Tactical. It's Substack. So I think if you just use that search term, you'll get there. But if you put the link in the show notes, that would be is super helpful. And I'm on X and Instagram as well. Just type in Pearl Snap Tactical, you're going to find it. And those are probably the channels I'm most active on.
Perfect, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Mark. I really do appreciate it. And I look forward to having you back on next time. Maybe we could talk about things more in depth. But until then, thank you so much.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on.
All right, thank you. Well, this is the War Room. Sergeant Barnes, Mark from Pearl Snap Tactical, and this is General Lance signing off.